As the summer sun rose over the fields of Plataea in central Greece, in August 479 BC, its light shimmered off the armor of two vast armies standing across from one another. On one side was amassed the mighty Persian invasion force, almost 100,000 men strong. On the other stood the 80,000 hoplite spearmen from the combined forces of the Greek city-states. They were determined to defend their homes and their freedom. On this day, the future of ancient Greece hung in the balance. The Battle of Plataea would be the decisive conflict of the legendary Greco-Persian Wars. But how did it come to this? To understand the full scope and significance of this apocalyptic clash, we need to go back 20 years. In 500 BC, the area known as Greece was not a single country, but rather a collection of fragmented city-states. Each one was generally small in size, with populations ranging from a few thousand to tens of thousands of people. Some of the most famous of these cities were Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes. These cities were constantly at war with each other as they fought for control of the limited resources in the area. A complex web of alliances, rivalries, and tensions typified Greece at this time. Such disunity and strife made the separate city-states tempting targets for a much larger, more powerful empire that was lurking just over the horizon: the Persians. The Persian Empire was only half a century old in 500 BC, but was already a vast superpower. Founded in 550 BC by Cyrus the Great, it had rapidly expanded through a series of brutal conquests under increasingly more aggressive kings. Its borders now reached from Egypt in the south to India in the east, and was poised to draw Europe into its orbit. The remarkable Persian expansion was driven by a military juggernaut. Its armies and navies were highly organized, with a sophisticated network of roads and communication systems that allowed for rapid mobilization of troops. Whenever the Persians conquered new regions, they appointed governors to rule on behalf of the king. These governors were usually Persian officials, known as satraps, who were tasked with raising money and men to fuel the empire's insatiable appetite for conquest. Yet the greatest test for the Persians was about to begin. Greece, the tiny region on their distant western borders, would not go down without a fight. But the spark of this war would appear not in Greece, but across the waves in Asia Minor, in a region known as Ionia, where Greeks had settled. Back in 546 BC, the mighty Persian king Cyrus had conquered the cities of the Ionian Greeks. As was typical, he appointed satraps to govern his new lands. They set about implementing Persian laws and extracting the taxes on behalf of the king. However, deep resentment remained in the hearts of the Greeks. When a new Persian king, Darius I, came to power in 522 BC, he appointed his half-brother, Artaphernes, as the new satrap. Over the course of the next 20 years, a new generation of Ionian Greeks would seek to throw off the crushing demands of the invaders. In 499 BC, the Ionian Greek city-states launched a sudden rebellion. While it caught Artaphernes off guard, it had been years in the planning. The Ionians had reached out to the Greek cities on the mainland for support. However, only two, Athens and Eretria, agreed. They sent 25 ships and armed soldiers. The revolt was initially successful, with the rebels capturing the local Persian capital of Sardis and burning it. An enraged Darius dispatched a massive army to crush the rebellion. While the Ionian rebels were ultimately defeated by the Persians, it would take 5 years of hard fighting for the empire to seize back control of the region. Darius's outrage now turned on the upstart Greek cities who had dared to support the Ionian rebels, namely Athens and Eretria. The Persian king decided to make an example of them. Darius ordered a mighty invasion force to be created, with the purpose of wiping these cities out of existence. In 490 BC, the Persian invasion fleet, numbering over 200 ships, set off from Asia Minor. Darius chose not to lead it himself, but placed two men in charge, a man called Datis and the son of Artaphernes. The Persian fleet sailed towards Greece by following the chain of islands across the Aegean Sea. On the way, it steamrolled past the islands of Samos, Naxos, and Delos, subduing them in the process. The Persians eventually landed on the island of Euboea and quickly destroyed the city of Eretria. With one of the two targets successfully punished, the Persians then turned south towards Athens. When they finally reached mainland Greece, the Persians decided to land at the Bay of Marathon, just 26 miles from Athens. When news of the landing reached Athens, the city panicked. However, an Athenian general called Miltiades acted decisively and mustered an army of around 10,000 soldiers who marched out to confront the Persians. The two armies faced each other, with the Persians clearly outnumbering the Athenians by at least 2-1. Knowing the odds against them, the Athenians took the initiative and launched a surprise charge on the Persian forces. This caught the invaders off guard, and in the panic, they broke ranks and fled back towards their ships. This allowed the Athenians to kill over 6,000 enemy soldiers before they escaped. The defeat demoralized the Persians, who had to cancel the invasion. King Darius was so angry about his commander's failure at Marathon that he vowed to take revenge on the Greeks. He planned to lead another expedition against Greece, this time with an even larger army. However, he would not live to achieve this. In October of 486 BC, Darius died suddenly, and his son, Xerxes I, took the throne. But it would take 5 years before the new king could carry out his father's revenge on the Greeks. During that time, a new leader would also rise to power in Athens, who would turn out to be a decisive factor in the second stage of the war. A new politician, called Themistocles, encouraged the people of Athens to be ready for a future invasion. He argued that rather than trying to defeat the Persians on land again, that they should strengthen their power on the sea. He convinced the Athenians to build a brand new navy, equipped with the latest warship design, known as triremes. Just as the last ships were being worked on, terrifying news was spreading. Xerxes had spent several years marshaling his armies and building a massive fleet to transport them across the Aegean Sea, and this force was now on its way. Xerxes had raised a truly massive army of over 200,000 soldiers, drawn from all over the Persian Empire. In the early months of 480 BC, Xerxes personally led his forces across the Hellespont, the modern-day Dardanelles, into Europe. As he marched them southwest through Thrace and Macedonia, the Persians captured and sacked several Greek cities as a warning to other Greek city-states. Back in Athens, a war council was held with other city-states, where the leaders admitted that they could not match the size of the invasion force, even if they combined all of their armies. So the Spartans decided to lead a combined army north, to seize control of a narrow path that the Persians needed to march through to reach Athens. If reached in time, then the Greeks could force the invaders to fight them in a smaller space, which would make the numerical difference less of a factor. The name of the pass was Thermopylae. During July and August of 480 BC, the Persian army marched southward towards Athens and were shocked to encounter the combined Greek forces at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. Having no choice but to break through, Xerxes ordered his vast hordes to attack. For 2 days, the Greek soldiers held their ground against wave after wave of Persian assaults. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the Greeks refused to give in. Exasperated, Xerxes needed a solution. On the 3rd day, a local Greek man named Ephialtes showed the Persians a hidden mountain path that allowed them to flank the Greek army and attack them from behind. When the invading forces began appearing to their rear, the Greeks realized that certain defeat was imminent. Thinking quickly, the Spartans ordered most of the Greek soldiers to escape, while they stayed behind to slow the Persians down. The final 300 Spartan hoplites fought bravely, but were eventually overwhelmed and killed by the Persian forces. The Battle of Thermopylae was a military defeat for the Greeks, but it bought precious time for the cities to the south to prepare. Following the Battle of Thermopylae, the Persian army continued their march towards Athens, ready to unleash their revenge, now 10 years in the waiting. However, when Xerxes arrived in the city, he found it abandoned. All of the people had been cleverly evacuated by Themistocles. Using the new navy, he had sailed the Athenians across the nearby strait to the island of Salamis. Enraged that he had been denied a great military conquest, Xerxes ordered the Persian army to sack and burn the city. With the smoke rising into the sky, Xerxes turned his attention to the island of Salamis. He knew the Athenians were now trapped there, and he would not be denied his victory. His navy sailed along the coast towards Salamis for the impending finale. It was now September when the 1,000 ships of the Persian fleet came into view of the Greeks at Salamis. Themistocles and the other Greek commanders who had assembled their ships together knew that they were in a precarious position. The Greek navy was sheltering in the strait that lay between the island and the mainland of Greece. Despite their combined strength, the Greeks could only muster 370 triremes, so were outnumbered 3-1. But the Greeks had a plan. If they could lure the larger Persian force into the narrow straits, their larger numbers would count for very little. However, how could they convince their enemies to fall for the trap? Themistocles sent a messenger to Xerxes, who told him that the Greeks secretly planned to flee under the cover of darkness. Convinced that this information was true, the Persian commanders were told to remain alert all night. But the escape never happened. By dawn, the Persians were tired and confused. Perhaps worried that they had let their prey escape, the invading ships were ordered to sail into the straits to pursue the fleeing Greeks. Xerxes was confident of the upcoming victory, and so had his golden throne set up on a hill where he could see the battle play out. He did not want to miss a single moment. As the Persian ships entered the narrow space, they were not greeted by panicked Greeks, but by almost 400 ships lined up, ready for battle. Caught unprepared and exhausted, the Persians became easy targets as the Greeks launched their strike. The Greek triremes were smaller and more maneuverable than the Persian ships, which the Greeks used to their advantage. They rammed the Persians and sank one ship after another. As the Persians realized the trouble they were in, many ships began to turn and escape. This led to a gridlock in the narrow straits, as oars and rigging became entangled. They became sitting ducks as the Greeks continued their assault. Xerxes was speechless as he saw the carnage unfold and his victory disappearing before his eyes. After hours of fighting, hundreds of Persian ships had been destroyed before the invaders could flee to safety. Realizing the size of the disaster before him, Xerxes prepared to flee from Greece himself, back to the safety of his palaces in Persia. Before he did, he placed his army under the command of a man called Mardonius, and ordered his soldiers to remain in Greece until after winter. Despite the losses at Salamis, the Persians were still in a strong position. Their army remained undefeated on land. As winter set in, Mardonius camped his forces in Thessaly and relied upon Greek cities who had allied with the Persians to feed and supply his army in preparation for a new attack in the springtime. During these colder months, the Persian army suffered from supply problems and lack of food. To feed his men, Mardonius's army ravaged the countryside, which only turned more Greeks against him. Meanwhile, the Greek city-states were preparing for the next phase of the war. They formed an alliance, known as the Hellenic League, and gathered a combined army under the command of the Spartans. As the year 480 BC turned to 479 BC, they planned to face Mardonius and drive the Persians from Greece once and for all. As long as the Greeks could choose the best ground that favored their troops, they might finally have the decisive victory they needed. So, the combined armies of the Hellenic League marched north to find Mardonius. In July of 479 BC, near the town of Plataea, they finally met. This was the great battle we began this video with. As the two forces eyed each other across the plains and rivers of Plataea, their numbers were roughly equal for the first time in the war. Both sides commanded around 80,000 troops each. Unfortunately, the Persians had a large contingent of cavalry, which the Greeks did not have. This meant that if they were caught on the open plain, the Greeks could quickly be surrounded and defeated. To keep their troops safe, the Greeks remained on the hills, where horsemen would be ineffective. Mardonius knew this and refused to engage while the Greeks held the geographic advantage. He was willing to wait, and so he did. For 3 days, neither side moved. To break the deadlock, Mardonius sent his cavalry towards them on minor attacking runs, hoping to draw the Greeks out of their positions. However, the Greeks refused to take the bait. After a week of tension, the Greeks finally made a simple mistake. One night, the Spartan soldiers tried to relocate to a nearby hill for a better advantage. However, the Persians noticed right away and launched the attack. The Greeks were divided and vulnerable. Realizing their fatal mistake, the Spartans turned around to fight their way back to join their allies. The sheer ferocity of the Spartan attack stunned the Persians, and the momentum quickly shifted. Within a few hours, the Persians became trapped, this time between the two halves of the Greek army. In the middle of the fighting, Mardonius, the Persian commander, was killed by a rock thrown at his head by a Greek soldier. With that, the Persian army broke and fled. By the end of the fighting, over half of the Persian troops lay dead. The disaster at Plataea was the final straw for Xerxes. He had invested too much time and too many resources on this failed Greek venture. Two decisive defeats convinced him that this small part of Europe was not worth the trouble. The Persian king ordered the last of his troops to flee back to the empire and leave the Greeks to their own devices. The Persian Wars were over, and the Greeks celebrated. They had overcome their own divisions to work together for the common good. Outnumbered in almost every battle, they had achieved the seemingly impossible. After winning the Greco-Persian Wars, the Greeks began to rebuild their cities and their civilization. This began a period known as the Golden Age of Greece. During it, the arts, philosophy, and science flourished, particularly in Athens. It was during this time that great thinkers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle lived and worked. With their newfound confidence, the Greeks were able to expand their influence throughout the Mediterranean world. They established colonies in Sicily and southern Italy, and they continued to trade with other civilizations throughout the region. Their presence in Italy would even influence the rise of the burgeoning Romans. I hope that you enjoyed this video. We would love it if you clicked the like button and became a subscriber so that we can make more videos like this. If you'd like to explore more about ancient history, visit the History Skills website. I look forward to seeing you again next time.